Today we've got a story for you about genius, power, and some truly shocking violence from 1,000 years ago. We're going to dig into the life of a man who was somehow both a revered religious scholar and a ruthless military general. Let's get into the incredible story of the warrior poet of Granada.
I mean, it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? But this is the true story of a man named Samuel ha-Nagid, whose life is almost too wild to be real. So the big question is, how on earth did he pull it off? Well, to get his story, first you've got to understand his world. All right, so let's set the scene. We're in al-Andalus. That's the name for Muslim-ruled Spain back in the early Middle Ages. And you have to understand, this was a time and a place unlike anywhere else in Europe. It was a major center of Jewish life, a real melting pot where cultures met, clashed, and sometimes created something absolutely brilliant. Okay, and here's where things get really interesting, because historians still argue fiercely about this period. Was it this paradise of tolerance, this ornament of the world where Muslims, Jews, and Christians all live together in peace? Or is that just a myth that ignores the very real power imbalances of the time? The truth, as we're about to see, is way more complicated. So to understand how this all worked, you have to know this one key term, dhimmi. Jews and Christians were called protected people. Now, this didn't mean equality, not by a long shot. It was a formal second-class status. They had to pay a special tax, and they had to live with certain restrictions. But, and this is a big but, it also created a kind of stability that allowed their communities to operate and, in a lot of ways, to really flourish. And oh boy, did they flourish. There's a reason this is called the golden age of Jewish culture in Spain. We're talking about a genuine explosion of intellectual and cultural activity, groundbreaking work in philosophy, science, medicine, and a stunning revival of Hebrew poetry. It was an absolutely unparalleled time of growth. And right in the middle of all this is our guy, Samuel ibn Nagrala. His life story perfectly captures all the opportunities and all the dangers of this incredible age. Seriously, his rise to power is one for the history books. And let me tell you, he did not have an easy start. Far from it. He was born in Merida, but a violent civil war forced him to flee his home in Córdoba. He was literally a refugee, running for his life. He ends up in Malaga with basically nothing, opening a tiny little spice shop just to get by. Just a humble merchant trying to make a living. His path from there is just astonishing. Get this, it all started with his handwriting. A servant from the local vizier's palace saw his beautiful script and asked him to write some letters. The vizier saw them, was blown away, and hired Samuel on the spot. From there, his sheer brilliance just took over. He became the vizier's most trusted advisor. So trusted that, on his deathbed, the vizier told the king, "You need to hire this guy." And the king did. In a totally unprecedented move, he appointed Samuel, a Jew, as the next vizier, the highest position in the kingdom. And as if that's not enough, he was then made general of the entire army, taking the title ha-Nagid, which means the prince. So, let's recap. Spice merchant to prince in general. Unbelievable. But this is where the story gets really, really complicated. Because Samuel ha-Nagid was basically two completely different people living in one body. On the one hand, you have the scholar. This guy was a genius, a devoutly religious man, a top expert on Jewish law, and on top of that, an incredible poet who was single-handedly breathing new life into the Hebrew language with poems about faith, love, and philosophy. Just listen to this line from one of his religious poems. You can just feel that deep faith, right? That hope. He sounds like a prophet here, offering comfort and promising salvation. It's truly beautiful stuff. But then, there's the other Samuel. This same deeply spiritual man was also a hardcore, battle-tested general. And we're not talking about some guy sitting in a tent miles from the action. For almost 20 years, he was on the front lines, personally leading the Muslim army of Granada into combat. And get this, the same man who wrote those beautiful poems about salvation also wrote this in his war poetry. Talk about a complete 180. The sword is more reliable than books. The poet of faith is also the poet of the sword. How do you even begin to square that? The scholar and the warrior, all in one person. It's the central puzzle of his entire life. All right, so let's fast forward to the end of the story, because this is where we see how quickly everything he built, everything this entire era stood for, could just fall apart. it's a tough lesson in how fragile a golden age can really be.
Amazingly, Samuel himself made it to the end. He died peacefully in his bed in 1056, still respected, still powerful. He'd played the treacherous political game his whole life and won. And in another move that was, again, totally unheard of, his son Joseph just inherited the job. The problem was, Joseph was nothing like his dad. Where Samuel was savvy and diplomatic, Joseph was seen as arrogant. Where Samuel had earned respect from pretty much everyone, Joseph was accused of playing favorites, using his power to help out the Jewish community, and that caused a lot of anger and resentment among the Muslim population. And all that resentment was like a powder keg just waiting for a match. And that match came in the form of a poem. A poet named Abu Ishaq wrote this absolutely vicious piece of propaganda that just ripped through the city like wildfire. It was simple, it was hateful, and it was a direct call to murder. So just 10 years after Samuel's death, the whole thing blew up. On one horrible day, a mob, completely fired up by that poem, storms the palace. They grab Joseph, the son of the great warrior poet, and they crucify him. And then their fury turned on everyone. The scale of the violence is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about over 1,500 Jewish families killed in a single day. Thousands of people murdered. The very community Samuel had spent his life building and protecting was just destroyed. And make no mistake, this wasn't just some riot that got out of hand. Historians look back at the 1066 Granada massacre as a horrifying turning point. It was the first pogrom of its kind in Muslim Spain. It completely shattered that fragile sense of security, and really, it marks the beginning of the end for the whole Golden Age. Which brings us right back to where we started. The life of Samuel ha-Nagid is absolutely incredible. A story of genius, of rising against all odds, but it ends in a bloodbath that destroys his family and his community. So it forces you to ask, how golden can an age really be if its foundations are so fragile that it can all be undone in a single day of blood and fire?